Welcome to Human Monsters. This episode was adapted from the memoir Father's Days, a true memoir of incest by Kathleen Brady. Kathleen Brady's earliest memories are from 1948. She grew up in Heartland, Minnesota, where her father worked as a prison guard. They were a blue-collar family and could not afford a house, so they lived in a trailer. The trailer was very small, especially since they were a family of 4 with another child on the way. Her mother found the presence of Kathleen and her sister, Ellen, so provocative and aggravating that she sent them off to live with relatives during the summer until the new baby was born. This was in the final trimester. Kathleen missed her mother during the time she was away, but ultimately her mother decided she would be better seen than heard, and she couldn't have one without the other. She missed her mother so much that her grandparents agreed to let her call on the phone so that Kathleen could hear her voice. Kathleen didn't miss her father. She hadn't seen him much throughout her childhood, and he hadn't participated much in her upbringing when he was physically present. He favored her older sister Ellen, who was born before he fought in World War II. Kathleen was born during his time of active duty, and by the time he returned, she was 2 years old, and they didn't form a bond. Sometimes he would rock her to sleep at night, but otherwise there was little relationship to speak of. When Kathleen returned home, her mother was even less approachable. She had given birth to her brother Andrew and didn't want to be touched by Kathleen, Ellen, or anyone else for that matter. 1949. Kathleen and her family moved from the trailer to a Victorian farmhouse in a rural area near Heartland. The house had run to squalor due to the previous owner's neglect, but the family was happy to have a domicile that offered up so much more space, even with a dirt floor in the kitchen. Her mother's mental health had become destabilized, and her father was very strict and emotionally unavailable for the most part, but they made the most of their situation. Her sister lost her status as favored child when Andy was born, and she never quite recovered from this reversal of status. She would eventually distance herself from the entire family, which started when she rejected Kathleen on the playground at school. Kathleen was deeply hurt. The girls found themselves at the bottom of the family hierarchy. On Saturdays, they were charged with the task of cleaning the house from top to bottom. Their mother hated housework and preferred to spend Saturdays with their father and Andy shopping in town. Ellen was especially resentful about this arrangement. There was a gulf between her mother and father. He enlisted in the Marines without consulting her so he could fight in the war. He went on hunting trips without asking her. She felt her opinion was important on such matters, but apparently he considered it to be irrelevant. Her father built a playhouse for the children. He was as strict as ever. Her mother bristled against his strictures and admonishments, but her bark was useless against his bite. He was domineering with everyone and would grill anyone who broke a rule. Infringements always incurred a consequence. Kathleen was able to accept all this provided she was actually at home. Her parents continued to send her to relatives' homes during the summer. She felt lonely and alienated in that atmosphere. She wanted her parents' attention and love, and she missed it terribly. 1951. Kathleen discovered sexuality in a spare room. She explained how this came about at the age of 7. There was also a bed in the room, and when I was almost 8, I found myself often crawling beneath its blankets, exploring my body's covert and mysterious places with the aid of a mirror and flashlight. moving as little as possible so the bed wouldn't squeak and alert anyone to my presence in the room. I thought what I saw in the mirror was ugly, but my exploring fingers produced an enjoyable sensation. Pursuing this, letting mirror and flashlight drop, I found that the harder I rubbed, the more intense the sensation became, the warmer my body grew. In one day, after these feelings rose to an acute pitch, something else happened. I didn't know what it was, this explosive flush that radiated from the center of my body, but I knew that it was pleasurable, that I liked feeling it, and that it was undoubtedly wrong, a sin. I also knew instinctively that it was a secret I must carefully guard. It was about that time that Kathleen's mother approached her father about returning to the workforce to resume her career as a nurse. Though her reasons for this were the hatred of motherhood and household maintenance, her pitch to him emphasized the financial benefits. He insisted that they were chugging along just fine on his salary. He was suspicious of her motives, assuming that her true game plan was to abandon him and the children. After all, it was hardly a secret in that house that she did not enjoy her roles. She was relentless in pursuit of his consent to let her rejoin the workforce. At one point, she tried the tack of reminding him that he deserted her when he ran off to the war, leaving her with a 2-year-old child. In spring of 1952, Kathleen's mother accepted a nursing position at a hospital over the objections of Tom, Kathleen's father. She worked a late shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Tom's schedule ran from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. Her parents opposed the idea of leaving the children alone or in the company of strangers. They arranged their work schedules so that at least one of them would be alone with the children. When her mother was off at work, Kathleen missed her as much as she did in summer. When her mother was at home, she slept, so she wasn't available then either. When she woke, she was so occupied with preparing for her next shift that she was inattentive with the children. Kathleen experienced typical childhood fears at night, such as shapes in the dark appearing as monsters and other malevolent figures. Her mother did little else to assuage her fears but to make a brief appearance in her room and tell her she was safe. On one occasion, there was an intense windstorm at night. Kathleen was roused awake by the winds that lashed their house at all sides. Kathleen went to her parents' bedroom door and knocked. Her father said, "Is that you, Katie?" She said, "I'm scared." "Come in here by me. I'll fix you up." His invitation was all it took for her fear to fall away. She rushed into the room and reclined beside him. He put his arm around her. He said, "You don't have to be afraid, ever. I'm right here." He slept only in his boxer shorts. He was considered a very handsome man, and she took pride in it, so much so that she carried a photo of him in her wallet and showed it off to her friends. He patted her back. He pressed her head against his shoulder. He kissed her neck tenderly. He said, "You can come in here and sleep with me any time you get scared, Katie." There was something different about the timbre of his voice. He was softly spoken. A grown-up might describe his manner of speaking in that moment with an adjective like seductive. It bore no resemblance to the hectoring tone he adopted when giving orders and correcting the children when they erred. Kathleen said, "Why does Mother have to work all night?" He said, "She doesn't have to. She just thinks she does. I've told her I don't like her gone at night, but she just does what she wants anyway. She thinks she's smarter than I am because she went to college. Kathleen said, I don't like it when she's gone. Tom said, maybe what she really wants is to get away from me. Kathleen didn't enjoy hearing him disparage her mother despite all her faults. She said, I don't like it when you talk about Mother that way. He pulled her tighter against him and said, Oh, you be quiet. I'm just fooling. She squirmed around so that her back was turned to him. She pulled the covers over her body. She was trying to convey to him that she wanted to go to sleep. He wouldn't stop speaking in that voice. It made her uncomfortable. In that same voice, he said, Remember, you can come in any time, except when your ma's around. Why can't I come in then? She doesn't like to share her bed with other women. He snickered at this. There was something ominous to Kathleen about that laughter. She recoiled from him. He pulled her back against his body. He passed his hands up and down her arms, her legs, her back. He said, And, Katie, don't say anything to your ma about us being in bed talking. As much as she hated this voice, she found his touch comforting. She said, Why not, Dad? Because. That's why. Just because. She didn't object to keeping this secret regarding this activity they engaged in involving their bodies. Kathleen's autoerotic activity was a secret she kept to herself. Taking that into consideration, keeping a secret with her father made sense to her at the time. Kathleen reveled in the attention she received from her father. Unlike her mother, he was loving and attentive. He took her on all sorts of excursions, like camping and hunting expeditions. She became her father's favorite. Ellen referred to her as Daddy's baby, and it was far from complimentary. Meanwhile, her parents saw little of each other, and their interactions were soured by endless bickering. Her father's sketchy behavior was extended to Ellen, too. She would be bathing in the bathroom or changing in her bedroom, and he would burst in unbidden. He would tell her he was doing it, quote, just to check. He insisted that she leave the doors open so that he could pop his head in and see what she was up to. His interest in Ellen graduated to sexually suggestive remarks and innuendo. It began with statements like, If you need to know anything about stuff like sex, you just ask me. You've got pretty good-looking legs, you know that? You don't need to go to the movies. You'll just get bad ideas. What's wrong, girl? You got hot pants or something? Kathleen began to act out. She stole money from a teacher's purse at school. She bullied a girl who was known for being a pushover. She felt remorse about these things, though it may have been a reaction against the powerlessness of being rejected and dismissed by her mother and Ellen. She described how she sought solace in her father's bed. Whatever discomforts I suffered during this time, questions about my own conduct, loneliness for mother, rejection by Ellen, they were eased in large measure when I lay beside my father in bed. As he caressed me, he told me I was sweet, lovable, his pal, and I felt secure, safe. The slight queasiness occasioned by his admonitions to secrecy and by that peculiar voice he sometimes used seemed inconsequential compared to the solace he gave me. Our time in bed, fondling and talking, seemed a natural extension of the companionship that had developed between us. Both Kathleen and her father began to undergo significant changes in 1953. A midlife crisis took hold in her father, disappointed as he was by the signs of aging on his body and hairline. Kathleen, on the other hand, was developing a figure as her breasts emerged. She was a tomboy and did not like the way her new proportions affected her ability to engage in athletics. Her bosom was ample enough that she acquired the nickname Chesty. She had some cursory dialogue with her mother about sex, but her mother was a repressed wasp type, so there were many blanks left to fill following these exchanges. When Kathleen was 8 years old, her mother scolded her for sitting in her father's lap. She said, "You're too big for that. It causes things to happen that shouldn't, and you cause it, so don't do it." She didn't get specific about why this was wrong and what it was Kathleen made happen that shouldn't. Nevertheless, Kathleen did put a stop to the practice. One day her mother approached both her and Ellen and said, "Do you girls know about sex and having babies?" Ellen said, "Oh, of course, Mother. We studied it in school, and Barbara Rapp told me everything she knows." Their mother was satisfied by this answer. She turned to Kathleen. "What about you, Kathy? What do you know?" "Everything. Ellen told me all about it." "Do either of you have any questions?" Kathleen did have questions, but she could tell that this conversation nearly had her mother squirming from discomfort, so she decided against grilling her on a subject she knew made her mother uneasy. Her mother said, "Well then, that's fine." And with that, sexuality as a topic of conversation was off the table. Kathleen saw educational films in school about menstruation and reproduction. She learned that when the man's sperm and the woman's egg meet, a baby is conceived. She found out that this was made possible through sexual intercourse. At home, Kathleen continued to explore on her own in private, as she noted. Meanwhile, in the bed in the spare room, I continued to teach myself nameless things. Using different techniques, I discovered, caused different feelings. I learned to intensify and prolong the pleasure. Sometimes while I was touching myself, pictures of Dad popped into my head. Speaking of her father, he made an exploration of his own that summer. Sometime that summer, Dad discovered my breasts. The air was warm, and I remember his hands sticking to my skin as they moved from my back to my chest. "Katie," he exclaimed, his delight evident. "What have you got here?" I hesitated, uncertain how to answer. "Oh, you know what they are," I said finally. "You're growing pretty early." His hands continued caressing my breasts. "Why, you're bigger than your ma already." I hated his mentioning mother, and I hated the terrible cackling sound that escaped from his mouth. At the same time, feelings were occurring in my body similar to those I experienced during my interludes in the spare room. I felt confused and frightened. "I think I'll go back to my room now," I murmured. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Does it bother you that I touched your tits?" I'd never heard my father use a word like tits. His language was always very proper, and he had an ironclad rule against swearing, disapproving even of certain slang expressions. I felt his arm slide off my back as I moved slowly and silently away from the bed. "You know, Katie, it's real hard for me not to touch you." His voice pulled me back. I despised its sound, but I loved the words it uttered. "You're such a good-looking, sweet little thing, so affectionate, so pleasing. You're so different from your crabby ma." I had returned to the bedside, and his hands reached up to stroke me. "I love you so much, Katie. You know, I'd do anything for you, and I know you want to please me too. But some people don't think I should touch you like this, especially your ma. So it's best for her if you don't tell her." "Why doesn't she think it's okay?" "She's naive about these things, probably because her upbringing was so strict. I think it's good for girls to learn things from their fathers, but everybody doesn't think the way I do." I wondered what naive meant, but I didn't ask. I wondered why people disagreed about these things, but I didn't ask that either. I just stood there, tugged between the poles of pleasure and fear, while his hands moved over my body. Of course, I wouldn't tell Mother, I decided. That would make him mad, and they'd probably fight about it. We'd had enough of that. I just wanted things to be peaceful. "The only way we can hurt anybody, Katie, is if we tell them," he said to me. "Otherwise, who are we hurting?" I supposed that was true. Touching me seemed to please Dad enormously, and I liked being able to do that. Mother didn't know, even though I often had a desire to tell her. The sensations his hands produced in me felt good. Now when I masturbated, which was more and more often, I always pictured him in my head. He now focused exclusively on my breasts when I crawled into bed with him several times a week. Slowly unbuttoning my pajama top, he stretched one of his large hands between my nipples, playing a game he'd devised of, quote, wiring, end quote, them together, teasing me, knowing I was aroused. My sexual curiosity was intense, and he knew that. So was my fear. "I'm scared, Daddy," I'd say to him. "I'll take care of you, Katie," he always replied. "You don't have to be afraid." "When is Mother coming back?" I'd ask. "Don't you worry about her," he'd say. "What she don't know can't hurt her." Any occasion that brought Kathleen out of the house would become a significant source of relief for her. Even her time spent in hospital during a period of convalescence following an appendectomy served as a vacation from her father's invasive hands. She now appreciated her summer vacations at the homes of relatives because it meant she was safely beyond the reach of her father. Kathleen broke down the symbiotic relationship she had with her father thusly. "My father and I came to each other out of great neediness. I wanted emotional sustenance, an assurance of love, an obliteration of the fear of abandonment. He wanted sexual gratification, perhaps to ease the pain of his own emptiness, to deny the inexorable movement of time, to assuage his bruised ego, and in a sense, at that time, we served each other very well." 1954. Kathleen described a day that was significant in her history with her father. There hadn't been much sexual activity in their relationship as of late. She tells the story. "One day in late September, I had followed my usual school night routine of studying from 7 to 9 and taking a bath, brushing my teeth, and putting on my pajamas before going to bed about 9:30. I liked this time of night when it was quiet, with Andy asleep already, the television off, Mother sewing or reading, Dad reading or getting ready for bed himself. Mother was away this night, and I'd already said good night to Dad before going into my room. When I crossed to the window to pull down the shade, I was caught by a scene in the farmhouse next door. Lit by an exposed bulb in the ceiling fixture, a young man and woman writhed on the bed, their naked bodies entangled. Fascinated, I stood unmoving, gazing at the spectacle outlined by our neighbor's window. I thought how strange it was that they weren't doing this later at night, in the dark, as I knew my parents did. I also thought, so that's how you do it, and I felt aroused watching them. You like watching that, Katie? Dad's voice caused me to start, and I reached up to yank down the shade. I was just pulling this down. You don't have to kid me. I could feel he'd moved closer. I still faced the now shuttered window. I know you were looking. You'd like to get a piece of that, wouldn't you? An embarrassed laugh spurted from my mouth. Quickly, I cut it off. You know, he went on, I think we should have a little talk. I'm afraid that what happened to Ellen will happen to you. You don't have to worry about me, Dad. I turned to face him, a tall figure dressed only in his pajama bottoms. I was still flustered, but tried to sound assured. I know enough not to get pregnant. I don't want to get married. That doesn't mean you can't have sex, Katie. It just means you have to be careful. You have to know how to do it and who to do it with. What an astonishing idea to come from my father, the enforcer of rules. Before I could even begin to absorb it, he continued, doesn't it get you excited when you see naked people making love like the two over there? Well, I suppose so. A little. This was a disconcerting revelation to make, but, after hesitating, I felt I really hadn't a choice. After all, he was my father. I was compelled to tell him the truth. And yes, it was interesting to watch those people. And yes, it did excite me. Remember when you used to crawl into bed with me, Katie? Silently, I nodded. You enjoyed that, didn't you? My discomfort made speech almost impossible. I guess so. I miss you sleeping with me, Katie. We could still do it when your ma's not around. She'll never know. It scares me, Dad. It's not right, you know. Who says? His voice now assumed the same oozing quality it had when I used to crawl into bed with him. You're my favorite girl, Katie, and I want to show you what this sex stuff is all about. I don't want you to get hurt. I don't want you to let those boyfriends of yours get to you. I won't, Dad. I sounded firm, even though the night before Larry Laughlin had nearly managed to slide his hand inside my bra while we sat in the front seat of his car. Sweet, gentle, my first date who had his own car. I'd been afraid to stop him. The couple in the back seat were doing whatever they wanted. I hated to make a fuss. Did you ever see one as big as mine? I was dragged back into the present by the sound of my father's voice and the sight of his penis jutting out from the fly of his pajama pants. He pulled me close to him, his hands on my shoulders. He pressed himself tight against me. His whistling breath was the only sound in the room. I stood absolutely still, letting him hold me, not knowing what else to do. The sensation of his body next to mine felt good. It also felt wrong. He led me to the bed and gently pushed down on my shoulders until I was sitting. He unbuttoned my pajama top and placed his fingers on my nipples, twisting, turning. He ran his hands over my breasts, down my body, underneath my pajama bottoms. He kissed my face, neck, breasts. This also felt good, and even more wrong and alarming. Pleasure and guilt from the very beginning. Dad, don't! I jumped up and moved away from the bed. Please leave me alone. Aw, Katie, it's all right. I know you like it. I always knew you were a little hot pants. Come on back here. I won't hurt you. I promise I won't hurt you. His voice was seductive. He was my father, and I loved him. This was his way, I supposed, of showing he loved me. He didn't want me to go through what Ellen had endured. Neither did I want to. If he showed me all about sex, then I'd know. Just one time, and that'll be that, I thought. Then I'll know. Let me show you just once. He echoed my thought, his voice cajoling. We won't go all the way. Let me just tell you what to do. Won't Mother be home soon? She called to say she'll be late. Katie, let me show you just this once. I moved back toward the bed, reluctance bowing to curiosity and my desire to please. He undid my pajama bottoms and pulled them down around my knees. Then he wrapped my hands around him, telling me to watch while his penis grew, crooning tales of how it worked when he was with Mother, where it went, and how it felt. His hands began touching my body again. He fastened his mouth for a moment on my breast, then brought it up to my mouth, kissing me. I was repelled by his wet lips, the feel of his crooked front teeth between them. I twisted my head to the side. His hands moved to my vagina, found my clitoris, rubbed over it back and forth. I wanted to run, and I wanted to stay. He told me to touch him again while his fingers continued brushing me. I did. His mouth returned to my breasts, each sucking motion sending exquisite feelings through me, pinning me in place, obliterating the desire to run, bringing me, finally, to climax. The instant that happened, guilt and shame flooded in, pushing away the pleasure. Don't let go of me yet, he urged, continuing to pump himself up and down in my hand until a thick liquid spilled out and ran down the leg of his pajamas. Then he lay still. A smile spread across his face. When I moved to get up, he drew me back with an affectionate hug and softly kissed my cheek. Thanks, Katie, he murmured. Thanks so much. As Kathleen went about her business over the next 24 hours, she feared that others, including her mother, would somehow intuit what had transpired between her and her father. She worried that it had marked her somehow. They couldn't see it, but she felt a mark of shame upon her. Domestic tranquility was achieved in Kathleen's house for a change, as her parents were getting along. Her father actually took an interest in her mother's life, asking her about work. There were fewer arguments between them, a relief to both remaining children, to be sure. Ellen moved out due to a teenage pregnancy, marrying and living with the father. Unfortunately, the change in her father's temperament hadn't been due to some kind of revelation or change of heart regarding his self-awareness. No, the change was catalyzed by something far less wholesome. He was a lecherous man, and his needs were being met. Unfortunately, he was still turning to his daughter to bring about this state of affairs. She described one such incident. On Saturday morning, I was straightening up my room when I heard Mother leave on her usual round of errands. Then I heard Dad giving Andy some change, suggesting he pick up his friend Billy on the way to the candy store and take him to play in the park at the end of the street. Then I heard Dad calling me. Katie, his voice came down the hall. Where are you, girl? In my room, I answered, wondering what he wanted. He appeared in the door, a funny grin on his face, his eyes somewhat cloudy, an obvious bulge at the front of his pants. Let me show you something, Katie. He spoke in that telltale voice, and I understood at once what was on his mind. No, Dad, I said quickly, afraid to rebuff him, but more afraid of doing again what we'd done several nights before. If I show you these things, Katie, you won't get in trouble like your sister did. I'm not going to get in trouble, Dad. Let me show you, girl. It's better for you to learn from me. Please, Dad, I pleaded with him. It's not right. Who says? He scoffed. What's so wrong about it? I was beginning to feel a little desperate. I know right from wrong, I said, as firmly as I could, and this is wrong. What would Mother think? She's never going to find out. He smiled at me now. If nobody knows, who are we hurting? I couldn't answer him. I stood mute. In the silence, he crossed the room, touched me, showed me again how to touch him, and directed us through the same sexual scene we'd played before. My feelings were the same. I was aroused and I was ashamed. The result was the same. He was pleased, and he was pleasant for several days afterward. This kind of transaction became routine. Once Kathleen was alone in the house with her father, and he had locked the doors. She knew what time it was. She always hoped each incident would be the last. It usually happened on Saturday mornings. Kathleen detailed the typical scenario that occurred under this circumstance. He always bathed first, running the water slowly into the tub, lathering his body, carefully rinsing it off, and emerging finally like a bridegroom from a ritual bath. Then came the verbal approach, made in that low, cooing voice I detested. His eyes glazed over with a film of desire. At first, he emphasized his wish to help me. I can teach you everything, Katie, he'd say. Then you'll never be in the position Ellen was. Gradually, as time passed, he began more and more to stress his own need. You gotta take care of me, Katie, he'd say. I just need more than your ma can give me. I don't know what will happen if I don't have you. Sometimes he'd tell me stories of women he'd had, mostly apocryphal, I believe, or sexual scenes he'd witnessed in the army. But whatever his tactics, they were effective. I'd become excited, hooked. Seeing my interest, he'd hurry to the bathroom and return with a towel, which he spread beneath him on the bed. Aware that he could easily arouse me by fondling or sucking my breasts, he'd focus on them first. Then, already erect from his own excitement, he'd rub his penis over my clitoris, slowly up and down. Finally, he would enter me with his fingers and guide me to a climax. After I was done, I'd bring him to orgasm. When that was over, grinning with satisfaction, he'd pick up the towel and take it into the bathroom, plunge it into hot water, wring it out, and hang it up to dry. I hated the sight of it, this terrible reminder in full view. I felt the odor of sperm still clung to it, filling the small room, and I was sure Mother would notice. She never did. Even more obvious, I thought, was when he used his underwear instead of a towel and threw the dirty jockey shorts directly into the laundry. She apparently was oblivious to this also. Dad often suggested variations on this basic sexual theme. He showed me 2 forms of oral sex, cunnilingus and fellatio, but I refused to repeat either. The former because I found it repugnant, the latter because it seemed to give him too much pleasure. When he encouraged me to have intercourse, describing how Mother liked to sit astride him and pump slowly up and down, I refused that also. I feared the pain from his large penis, and I believed that if I didn't do that, perhaps my other sins, masturbation, childhood stealing, swearing, thinking bad thoughts, would be forgiven. When I said no to something, Dad always backed down quickly, letting me decide, assuring me, quote, "We'll only do what you like." He could have forced me any time to do anything he wished. That he never did increased my confusion. His consideration of my wishes made his behavior seem loving, and at first I was insulated from the full force of my guilt and disgust by two things: my sexual curiosity and my overwhelming need for love, attention, approval. For his part, so long as I chose our acts, he made himself believe he was accommodating me. He prided himself on his great restraint. Kathleen couldn't bring herself to tell her mother about the sexual impropriety that had been going on between her and her father. She feared that her mother would consider her to be at fault. With Ellen gone, Kathleen felt pressured to be the model child that Ellen hadn't embodied for them. Pleasing them both included sexually satisfying her father and keeping the shameful truth from her mother. Things continued along the same trajectory, and the atmosphere at home was relaxed, very much to her liking. Kathleen was successful in her studies at school, had an active social life, and a boyfriend. Accommodating her father's sexual expectations was one source of stress for Kathleen at this time. Kathleen recalled how this affected her. His demands were becoming regular and insistent. It was harder and harder to maintain the illusion that each time would be the last. I was no longer curious. I knew how things were done, what they felt like. I wanted him to leave me alone. Still, every time he approached me, I would ultimately respond. He brought her squirrel hunting, but his real agenda was to have sex with her in the forest. She reluctantly acquiesced on the first trip. She broke it down thusly. "Here's a perfect place," he said, finally, pointing with his gun to a gentle hollow in the ground surrounded by tall, leafy trees. "I don't feel like it, Dad," I said softly. "Uncle Walt might see us." "Aw, Katie, come on, look at me. You can't leave me like this." He began arranging the dry leaves in the hollow into a nest. The hot sun overhead filtered through the leaves, and it was absolutely silent. "Walt's in the barn by now, and he won't be watching for us. No one knows we're here." He propped his gun against a tree and settled into the nest, pulling me down beside him. Reaching a hand beneath my baggy blue jeans, he was overjoyed to discover I was wet. "Why, you little tease," he exclaimed. "You're as horny as me, aren't you? You want some, don't you?" He didn't need to hear my muffled, sheepish affirmative to continue. He didn't need to hold me down with one of his long legs, pinning mine. The thought of escaping him had never occurred to me. I could endure this one more time. The litany began in my head, and since I had to, I might as well enjoy it. But the enjoyment was not unmixed. He sucked my breasts, and I felt wildly excited and terribly angry. He entered me with his fingers, in a surge of hate combined with desire. I tried as much as I could to hide my pleasure from him. I tried to mute my response. Still, he saw my excitement, and a grin spread across his face. "I knew you wanted it," he said. "You can't fool me." During the second outing, she demurred. He was also aware that she was dating boys at the time. As retaliation for both, he confiscated the rifle he bought for her, refurbished it, and gave it to her brother. Eventually, he proposed camping trips for the whole family. Incredibly, he tried to buttonhole Kathleen for quickies when he felt they wouldn't get caught. She had the presence of mind to refuse. Ultimately, these outings were planned as a ploy to prevent Kathleen from dating boys. God forbid she would want to get it on with somebody other than her father. On one trip, Kathleen brought to her father's attention the fact that she had a date, and the scheduled pickup time was 6 p.m. Her father resisted this early return, but eventually an unspoken agreement emerged between him and Kathleen. They established a barter system wherein she would get what she wanted by gratifying him sexually. What happened to mowing the lawn or washing the car for pocket money? To quote Kathleen, we began to negotiate with each other, and sex was the currency of our transactions. I was beginning to accept that I was trapped in this sexual liaison with my father and beginning to learn to use it to my advantage. She convinced him to buy a car she wanted and to move to a house she favored. They even began to attend a church that was well attended by the local elite, all at her urging. At that point, her father was willing to do just about anything to keep having sex with his daughter. She described her motivation to escalate herself and the family in social standing. Appearances were becoming crucial to me. Each day that my incestuous relationship with my father continued, my commitment to the appearance of normality grew deeper. Each increase in my guilt, shame, and disgust caused an equal increase in my need to create a glossy, pleasing surface. The darker the inside, the brighter the outside must be to hide it. I had by now an obsession with cleanliness, bathing 2 or 3 times a day, never wearing clothes more than once without washing or dry cleaning them, shampooing my hair daily. If I looked clean, my dirty little secret wouldn't show. I'd come to believe that I must, single-handedly, make us seem a normal, happy family. Keeping him satisfied sexually also kept relations between her mother and father harmonious. Unaware of the sordid side of Kathleen and Tom's relationship, her mother encouraged their close rapport. Indeed, if Kathleen asked her mother for a favor, she would be told to redirect it to her father. A schism emerged in Kathleen's psyche, and it resulted in 2 personas, one internal, the other external. She explains, by the time I reached high school, I had 2 absolutely separate personalities. The public one, exhibited to family and friends alike, was friendly, stable, honest, thoughtful, courteous, trustworthy, reliable, and cooperative. The private one was fearful, isolated, anxious, and depressed. In her first year of high school, Kathleen met her first true love, the boy she would marry, Roger Brady. His family were as flush with money as they were with prestige. She was excited to have won the favor of such a boy. The one undercurrent of worry, however, was that her father was very much infatuated with her. She had no idea how he would react to the presence of Roger in her life. It was both emotional and sexual incest in that she had completely displaced his wife in terms of being the number one female in his life. When she had a date, he would become jealous and possessive, stomping about the house on the warpath. He had become so possessive that he didn't even want her spending time with her girlfriends. Kathleen realized that there was only one way she could convince her father to let her see her boyfriend. As she recalls, Dad appeared in my bedroom doorway, a towel wrapped around his waist. I want to talk to you, Dad, I said before he could begin his build-up. Sure, Katie, he responded warmly, coming over to the bed. You know you can discuss anything with me. What's on your mind? I wish you liked Roger better. I don't see what you've got against him. Oh, he's nothing but a spoiled, rich brat. You can do better than him. But I like him, Dad. He's really nice if you just give him a chance. Well, I don't trust him. His father's a sneak, and probably he is too. Well, I said firmly, I like him, and I like going out with him. I don't like you spending too much time with him, Katie. I don't want you getting in trouble. Oh, I won't, Dad. and I just want to see him a few times a week. Well, that depends on you, on how good you behave. I'll be fine, Dad, I said, reaching my hand beneath his towel. You'll see. We understood each other perfectly. The bargain was sealed. She also appealed to his loins to convince him to buy her a used car. He was helpless against it, responding with statements like, "You're such a tease, you little hot pants. I know you want it. You just don't want to admit it." She began to question her status as a victim since she was capitalizing on it to get what she wanted. Sadly, it is very easy to forget that he was a perpetrator who exploited her victimhood for his own personal gain. Eventually, Kathleen began masturbating after a lapse of 2 years. She felt that if she could satisfy herself, she would be less likely to be aroused by her father. Unfortunately, sometimes her fantasies were disrupted by images of sex with him, and she would feel ashamed and disgusted. She detailed the internal struggle that arose during her sexual encounters with her father. When he and I were having sex, I tried to deny myself orgasms, doing everything possible to divorce myself from the sexual moment. I found ways to make myself absent, recalling a conversation with a neighbor, a homework assignment, a grocery list, anything anti-sexual, ways to go out of focus, to pretend it wasn't happening. And I also learned to pretend that it was, faking orgasms, to bring episodes to an end. There were still times, however, when I succumbed to his stimulation and responded genuinely. Those were occasions for severe self-flagellation. "How could you let it happen?" I'd berate myself. "You're sick, and you're bad, and you've no one to blame but yourself. You know you enjoyed it. It's obviously your fault." When she did refuse to have sex with him, he would take it out on everybody. Though only Kathleen and Tom knew what the source of his animus was, everybody suffered to a degree. His feeling of entitlement about the whole thing was astonishing. After several episodes of that, her mother read him the riot act. "You just straighten up, Tom, or I'm leaving and taking the kids with me. You're making life miserable around here, and I'm plenty tired of it." As this went on, Kathleen's self-loathing proceeded along the same upswing. As she noted, "It was on myself, of course, that I rendered my harshest judgment. I abhorred the pleasure I took in knowing I could manipulate Dad if I chose to. I detested the weakness and passivity that kept my submitting to him. I was angry that I'd created the situation in the first place. And I must have done so. Dad said I had. He said I was curious, and I was. He said I liked the sex, and it was true. Sometimes I had. And in addition to all that, if it weren't my fault, surely I'd be able to tell Mother." Tom resisted the idea of Kathleen getting a summer job. The last thing she wanted was to be at home all day as a plaything for her father. Eventually, Kathleen would do anything to avoid having sex with Tom. She would fake her period, get involved in more extracurricular activities to keep herself away from home. His idle hands were the devil's workshop, and she would do anything to avoid reporting for her shift. She would try to keep Andy in the house during his free time. She would try to keep her mother from leaving when she had to go shopping. Anything to avoid being alone with her father. She would offer to accompany her mother to the shops, but her mother felt she would get it done faster without her. When he tried to persuade her to give it up after she refused him, the exchange would go something like, "I need it more than she does, Katie. You gotta take care of me. It's not right. It makes me feel too guilty. But I need you, Katie. I get so excited around you that I can't control myself. You could take care of yourself, you know. You could masturbate. Men don't do that, he scoffed. Only queers. I have to have a woman, Katie. I need to be attracted to someone before I can make love with them. And I'm attracted to you. I want you. You got to take care of me. Quite often, Kathleen would capitulate to shut him up. She frequently turned to her religious faith in an effort to cleanse herself of the feelings that imbued her after being raped by her father, with limited success. And so the cycle went, where her father would make life a hell on earth for everybody in the household, especially Kathleen, and she would accommodate his sexual demands to make it all better. She would feel arousal, disgust, shame, and sorrow all at once. Roger went to university after graduating high school, and, for the most part, his attentions went with him. He wrote occasionally and visited even less often. Kathleen dated another boy, but Roger always had a place in her heart. Her father, of course, couldn't resist any opportunity to run Roger down. Tom commemorated Kathleen's 18th birthday and initial step into adulthood by taking her to local bars. He got shit-faced along the way. He slow-danced with her by holding her too tightly. He made lewd remarks about other attractive women in the bars. He was a real lounge lizard and a lowlife, as it turned out. His lasciviousness built to a crescendo, and, with an empty house awaiting them at the end of the night, she dreaded what he had in store. When they returned, he went to work on her immediately to convince her to have sex with him. As she recounted, at home, in bed, he urged me to have intercourse with him, my resistance somewhat lowered by alcohol, and still wanting to please him, to make sure he'd love me. I tried. Do it this way, Katie, he said, his voice shaking with excitement as he guided my body onto his. Your ma likes it this way, and you will too. Just go up and down, real slow, just up and down. With his hands on my hips, he tried to pull me down onto his enormous penis, thrusting inward, upward. I felt it filling me, moving deeper inside, and I felt pain. It was too big. I was terrified. It hurts, Dad, I cried out. The little girl looking to her father for protection. I don't want to do it. Okay, Katie, okay, he said, soothing, gentle. You don't have to. We'll just do what you like. What I liked at this point was what was quickest. What he liked was denying responsibility. If I'd completed intercourse with him, he would have rationalized that he was accommodating me. He never missed a chance to reinforce the idea that I was the initiator, and he did it very effectively. My sense of responsibility, the thing that bound me most forcefully to silence, was strong. Do you remember how you used to be? He'd ask me. How was I? I'd wonder. Do you remember what a little tease you are? It was true, I had been. One piece clicked into place. Do you remember how you used to crawl in bed with me? Yes, I had done that. Another piece. You were such little hot pants, remember? I recalled my curiosity. My God, it was clear. I'd led him on, seduced him. I must have. Whatever activities Kathleen involved herself with outside of the home, her father made sure to ridicule, condemn, or belittle. Ultimately, anything that took Kathleen away from him and made it impossible for her to gratify him sexually was no good in his books. Meanwhile, the more she resisted his sexual advances, the more desperate and determined he became to elicit her involvement. Kathleen wanted to tell somebody about the abuse. The problem was, she worried about her mother's reaction. She was concerned that she would blame her and consider her a sick and immoral person. She even feared her mother would no longer love her. Roger began returning home on weekends. After an undistinguished career in post-secondary scholarship, he took up his father's offer to run the family business. Kathleen made it her goal to convince him to marry her. It wasn't an easy sell. No matter how he felt about her, his well-to-do family did not approve of him getting involved with someone as common as Kathleen. She went to work convincing him that, though she didn't come from a comparable background, she could fit the bill in every other way. She wanted to marry her way out of her father's house. Roger proposed to her, but with conditions. It would be a lengthy engagement. For starters, he would postpone the moment when he announced it to his parents until he was sure the time was right. Kathleen was thrilled nonetheless. For once, the future was hopeful. There was one final occasion when Kathleen made it clear to Tom that she did not wish to satisfy him sexually anymore. As she told it, he stood up, looming over me, his body quivering in anticipation. "How about taking care of me?" he said. "I need it real bad." "No, Dad, I don't want to." My heart was thudding in my ears, making my voice sound faint. "I don't want to do it ever again, and I'm not going to." "What's the matter with you?" He was irritated by my defiance, but not really taking me seriously. "It's wrong, Dad. The whole thing's wrong, and you know it, and I just can't go on with it. Besides," I blurted, "I'm engaged now." "Engaged?" He was stunned. "Who to?" "To Roger." "When did that happen?" "This afternoon. And it's supposed to be a secret, but I want you to know because I can't go to bed with you anymore. I belong to someone else now. Take care of me just one more time. You see how bad I need it." And indeed I could. It was pathetic. This huge man, naked, begging, tears of frustration spilling from his eyes. "I can't," I said. "It makes me feel too guilty. I worry that we'll get caught. I worry that Roger will find out." His mien of entreaty vanished in a sweep of panic. "Don't you ever tell him about us," he said urgently. "Don't worry," I replied fervently. "He'd never understand. He'd think it was sick. He'd kill you." "No one understands like we do, isn't that right, Katie?" I understood nothing except that I wanted to shed this life and begin a new one where I'd be safe, respected, loved. "I guess it's time I let you grow up," he said. "It'll be hard for me, but I guess you're old enough to know what you want. Katie, have you done it with him yet?" I refused to discuss my sex life. "If you haven't, we could practice. We could go all the way." "No thanks, Dad," I said politely. "I can wait to do that with Roger." "I'm going to miss you taking care of me, Kathy," he said, finally dropping my nickname. "Do you know that?" I nodded. "Maybe now you can get closer to Mother," I suggested. "I think she'd like that." "I don't know," he grumbled, slumping back down onto the bed. "Do you hate me?" "No, Dad. Of course not." "Let's just forget about it." "Okay, but promise me one thing. If you ever need me to take care of you, before you're married or after, you just let me know, okay?" Kathleen explained how she coped with living at home with her father while coming to terms with what had transpired between them. "When I ended the sexual relationship with my father, I decided also to forget it. It was a grotesque, recurring dream that was now over. Nothing would be served by dwelling on it. I was determined to obliterate it, to put it literally out of my mind. I simply wouldn't think of it. That I continued to live at home for 4 more years, subjected to my father as a constant reminder, made this an enormous task, but my repressive powers, developed and refined over the years, were so great by now that I almost brought it off. Seldom did the memory of incest filter through to my consciousness. I adopted a way of relating to my father that was a natural outgrowth of the public persona I'd built up. Still eager to please and to avoid conflict, I was pleasant, accommodating in many ways, and unfailingly superficial. I was able at home, for the most part, to skim along with a sort of vapid amiability that made me virtually immune to anything authentic. Dad found it difficult to have me under his roof, but unavailable to him. He nagged at me constantly about almost everything. He made nasty remarks about me, about Roger, whenever an opening presented itself. He urged me to get on with marriage, insinuating that he knew everything about my sexual conduct with Roger, warning me I'd get into trouble if I kept it up. He brooded more than ever. Now that I had Roger, I began to lose my appetite for mass approval, preferring to focus exclusively on him. Having too many people around confused me. I invariably wanted to please them all, a difficult and exhausting chore. Friends were draining, demanding, I decided. They asked questions. They took up my time. They flirted with my boyfriend. Who needed them? I began to drift away from my high school crowd. Kathleen carefully crafted her appearance and behavior so that it would be more becoming of a woman suited to the bride of an aristocrat. After Roger returned from a tour of duty with the National Guard, they spent more and more time together. They spent a lot of time with Ellen and Bucky, which made Roger feel appreciated since they were in awe of his gold-plated social status. Roger finally introduced Kathleen to his parents. The introduction had gone well, and Kathleen began visualizing and planning their wedding in earnest. Naturally, her father never hesitated to besmirch the pending occasion, but even he did not succeed in tainting her excitement. Meanwhile, Kathleen had been accepted by Roger's family to such a degree that she became employed at their company. Kathleen would catch disturbing glimpses of Roger's dark side. He wasn't physically abusive, but he was prone to fits of rage, chastising people, especially women, when he didn't get his way. During a pregnancy scare, he told Kathleen that it was something she would have to bear on her own. Kathleen had experience with a temperamental male doing his utmost to ensure that he didn't suffer alone, so she tolerated his tantrums when she couldn't placate him. He long delayed setting a date for the wedding. At one point, Kathleen concluded that he was just using her for sex. One day, she gave him an ultimatum: set a date or she would leave him. He gave her a date, July 23rd, 1966. Now she knew she was not just a passing fancy. Kathleen took the unorthodox step of having both parents walk her down the aisle. This further ensured, in her mind anyway, that she would be assured of her liberty. Her father conveyed to her his closing salutations as a father of a girl who was soon to be a woman, while implying that she was welcome to rejoin him in their incestuous transactions, should she wish to, in the event that her marriage falters. As if that idea wasn't completely insane. There were signs on the wedding night that this marriage would need work. Kathleen explained how inauspicious their new life together appeared within the first 24 hours of having been wedded. Roger's parents' wedding gift to us was a honeymoon trip to Acapulco. Prudent, serious, we elected instead to put the money in the bank to spend as needed on our new home. We traveled 40 miles away to a new Howard Johnson's for our wedding night. The enchantment I'd expected when we were at last alone together as man and wife was missing. Roger's entrances into my body felt as rough and unsatisfying as they had in the back seat of the car. An overabundance of champagne left me feeling fuzzy and with a dreadful taste in my mouth. When I eventually slept, I dreamed the room had been broken into and I'd been raped. Awakening in the morning, I found the room empty, Roger having gone for a solitary swim. The sense of foreboding fluttering around my edges increased the next day when we picked up the Schnauzer puppy that was Roger's wedding present to me and, immediately and obviously, my competition. It was rather like being presented with a baby the day after one's wedding. The new young life took precedence over everything. Roger lavished attention on the dog, inviting her to sleep in our bed. Kathleen had very romantic notions of how her marriage would transpire beyond the rubric of the wedding day. She anticipated wedded bliss in everything from lovemaking to decisions regarding home decor. She detailed her disappointment. Roger was withdrawn, nervous. He seemed wholly unaware of my needs or my expectations, ill at ease with our intimate situation, eager only to get back to work. The truth was visible in that first week. Dressing up in elegant clothes and repeating words to each other beneath the roof of a church had not altered us. He was he and I was I. Only our status was different. The magic simply hadn't occurred. I wasn't prepared to accept and face this reality any more than any other in my life, looking at it only long enough to see how I might be responsible. Clearly, I must be doing something to cause his inattentive behavior. Ultimately, she expected him to take to marriage and domesticity in a manner typical of the bride. He was more focused on his career and his goal to become a millionaire in his 30s. Deciding where to position an armoire was the last thing that concerned him. She did all she could to please him, but he was the spoiled son of a doting and indulgent mother. If he didn't like Kathleen's cooking, he would say so, refusing to eat it and dumping it in the sink. He would refer to it as trash or slop. He had never been taught to appreciate anything in his life, and that included the efforts of others to please him. Kathleen worked full-time, cleaned, and cooked, doing all she could to be the ideal wife. When he complained about how she was doing things, she said nothing and even smiled as much as possible so as not to rile him. His sexual output left a lot to be desired, since it evinced no desire in her. He preferred the kind of quickies that were devoid of foreplay, passion, and tenderness. There was no pillow talk, unless you consider that his complaints fit the bill. They never even kissed anymore. Still, she did not deny him sex when he wanted it. It dawned on Kathleen one day that she essentially married her father. As she put it, one evening several months into our marriage, I was ironing one of Roger's countless white shirts, watching on television the obligatory torrid love scene in a romantic 1940s movie. Home early, he barged into the room and snapped off the set with a disparaging remark. "Who does he think he is?" I said to myself. Silently, of course. My father? Yes, the signs, the similarities were there. Another authoritarian figure who completely governed my life, whom I couldn't refuse. Another spoiled child, needing, insisting upon his own way. I did what I hoped would make Roger love me. I ended up feeling used. I had relinquished my right to say no. Before marriage, Roger had sometimes seemed sensitive to my needs, willing to understand and respond to them. Now that I was captive, he paid them no attention. He sought to satisfy only himself, no matter the price for me. Kathleen coped by immersing herself in endless activity, like she'd done in high school. Meanwhile, Relations between her and Roger continued to deteriorate. It got to the point where if she reached out to him for affection, she would be rebuffed. At times, he would outright tell her to leave him alone. The rejection and subsequent alienation were acute and resistant to resilience. Her life as a wife had become lonely and unfulfilling. She had never felt so unloved. He would put her down, lashing her to and fro with remarks about how she was stupid, incompetent, poorly bred, and only occupying her position in local society because of him. Apparently, he felt she ought to be grateful to so much as occupy the same zip code as him. Kathleen decided the best way to approach the situation was to detach herself emotionally. That was what he wanted, and it was what he'd done, so it was the most appropriate response. To make matters worse, he didn't want her doing anything outside the home. He wanted to control every aspect of her life. Her father had been a prison guard, and now she was married to a warden. Kathleen and Ellen became closer than ever. Kathleen paid Ellen to clean her house, and they bonded over their dissatisfying marriages. It was more of a sisterhood than ever. Roger disapproved of this relationship, feeling that it was too much of a distraction from Kathleen's domestic responsibilities. Kathleen watched the last vestiges of her autonomy slip away when Roger's parents got into a serious car accident, which left his father dead and his mother disabled and relegated to a wheelchair. Roger decided that they must move into his parents' house so they could take care of his mother. Kathleen argued that they should hire a nurse to look after her. Roger balked at this idea and packed his bags. He told her she could remain at their house if she wanted. He was moving in with his mother. Kathleen and Roger's house embodied, both literally and symbolically, her own independent existence. It was half hers. She didn't want to move in with Roger's mother, but she was afraid to live in their house alone. So she capitulated and gave up what remained of her independence. Kathleen felt that his mother was more important to him than her. Roger was joined at the hip to his mother. They had always been close, but now that they bonded over their grief at his father's death, they were inseparable. So inseparable that she was included in any activity in which her disability could be accommodated. Whether Kathleen wanted it or not, her mother-in-law's companionship would become a fixture in her life. He even involved his mother in personal matters that are normally only settled in discussions between husband and wife. It got to the point where Kathleen and Roger held aloof to each other, mostly communicating with small talk and other formalities. Roger was directing this stage play, and his mother was his co-star. Kathleen was a supporting player and occasional understudy. They proposed a solution to binding the marriage together as it gradually disintegrated. They would have a child. That would make everything right, wouldn't it? That would guarantee happiness and marital bliss, wouldn't it? During Kathleen's pregnancy, she didn't feel different. Nothing had changed in her day-to-day life except the complications of pregnancy. She had been figuratively nauseated by her husband's attachment to his mother. Now she would be literally nauseated by morning sickness. Having a baby did not turn out to be the cure-all for their ailing marriage she hoped it would be. Eventually, she insisted that they resume their life as husband and wife without her mother-in-law's presence. To offer some reassurance, he embarked on some home improvements at their old house. When their daughter was born in August 1970, he was far from overjoyed. He resented that the baby would require so much of Kathleen's time. He even said, Someday it's going to be just you and me. Remember that. He downplayed the importance of the baby's care and presence in their lives. He admonished her for taking so much time off work. He felt she should be able to care for a newborn and work full time without missing a beat. He would say things like, Kathy, there are countries where pregnant women walk in the fields behind the plows, and when the time comes, they lay the plow on the ground, squat down and give birth, and return to the plow. Apparently, pre- and postnatal care was as irrelevant and distasteful to him as it is commonly regarded in third world shitholes. He also refused to assist her in the baby's care, considering it to be not just Kathleen's responsibility, but her quote-unquote problem. Roger continued to bitch, moan, and whine about his responsibilities. Home improvements, his responsibilities at work. He was always complaining about these expectations, characterizing them as burdensome. Kathleen expected him to be stronger and take it like a man. He spoke dismissively of her contributions as a mother, wife, and homemaker. You're getting lazy. I think you'd better get back to work. Nobody in this family gets to just lie around. You'd better decide what your contribution's going to be to keeping this place going, especially if you want all the expensive trimmings. Kathleen became pregnant with her second child after having studied for and becoming licensed to be a real estate agent. She excelled in the business, and it restored her autonomy and self-esteem. Though Roger felt some pride about this, he was also jealous because her efforts in real estate subtracted from her duties as a wife. One day he declared to her, "You were nothing until you married me. The only reason you're getting listings and making sales is because you're Brady." She took too much pride in her accomplishments to allow these remarks to affect her. He would criticize her for spending too much time working and not enough taking care of him. He still expected a 3-course meal every evening amid the child care and professional activity that consumed her life. Either way, she couldn't win with him. Her children were the only source of joy in her life at the time. Roger eventually spent more and more time on their 2 daughters and doted on them. His relations with them were far more harmonious than those with Kathleen. Roger and Kathleen began to argue more often. Things came to a head when he proposed getting a new dog, an idea she opposed. He ignored her protests and presented her with one on Mother's Day, 1975. The puppy was presented with a bouquet of roses. She threw the roses to the ground. This was the first time she considered divorce. She was sick of her feelings and needs being ignored. When he decided he wanted something, he did not hesitate to force it upon her, and she was fed up with it. Speaking of forcing things upon her, the 20-minute quickies that comprised their sex life lost their ability to arouse her. He would tell her she had no right to refuse him and that it was her responsibility to please him in this arena. Having stated his case thusly, she saw her father in him. She told Roger she needed more time to climax, which would involve foreplay. He conceded that he had a problem with premature ejaculation. They made an appointment to attend the Masters and Johnson's sex clinic for couples. She perceived his willingness to undergo this therapy as transactional and self-serving. The way he saw it, if learning how to touch his wife would enable her to please him better, he was game. Anger rose up within her due to this. It was rooted in all the years she spent pleasing her father, who rewarded her but was really only doing it for himself. When Kathleen declared her intention to go on leave from the company so she could devote all her time and energy to the upbringing of the children, Roger punished her with verbal abuse. He also confiscated the company car that was issued to her. She took the step of asking him to leave the home for a while. She felt it would give both of them an opportunity to view their marriage with more objectivity. She, in particular, was keen to put him in the position where he would view his past behavior more clearly. At the time, he did not possess the self-awareness to clarify his perspective on his conduct. 4 days after he left, he called and asked if they could talk. She had become so lonely by then that she agreed to meet with him. She detailed the conditions that would enable his return: more help with household upkeep and child care, some effort to see things from her point of view, and an end to his inclination to insist upon her role as sexual superwoman, giving him sex on demand and according to his strict specifications. After a few weeks, Roger went back to his old ways. As he put it, "It's not that I can't change, I'm just not going to." Things had only gotten worse between them. She decided they should legally separate. One morning he begged her for sex, but she wouldn't indulge him. One night he told her that if she didn't undergo counseling, he would have her committed to a psychiatric hospital. Essentially, he blamed her for all their marital problems. At one point, he said, "You remember what a little tease you were? You know you liked it. You got to take care of me, Katie. I need it real bad. If you don't take care of me, I don't know what I'll do." At this point, it was the hybrid of words spoken by her father and Roger that melded together in the present. Semantically, they were nearly indistinguishable. That conversation was the final nail in that marriage's coffin. A few days later, Kathleen sat down with Roger at the dining room table. She said, "The divorce papers will be ready tomorrow, Roger. The sheriff will serve them to you at your attorney's office. I can't live with you, and I don't want to add another 10 years to our marriage trying to." He said, "I thought you were kidding about this divorce thing." Kathleen said, "I know. That's one of the problems. You've never taken me seriously, as a human being, as a business partner, as anything." He said, "Your parents did this to you. I've tried to change you, but it doesn't work. You're no damn good." She said, "I know I can't change you. I can only change myself. But you won't allow it." Roger said, "What about the children? Any life would be better for them than this one. All they hear is business talk and arguments. Also, I'd like them to respect me. I don't see how they could, watching me live completely on your terms." Roger tried taking the tack of approaching her and putting his arms around her, as if he could love her into staying. It was too little too late. He was kicking a dead horse. Kathleen said, "Please just leave me alone." He left the house that afternoon. Kathleen's parents did not approve of her decision to divorce Roger, but when she reached her father at a time when her mother was out of the house and broached the subject of their sexual encounters, he responded favorably, more than she cared for. She asked him to go to her house so they could discuss that history. He opened with, "I hoped you'd want to discuss this sometime. I never brought it up when Roger was around because I figured you didn't need me. I'm available any time, you know. I told you that once, but I guess you forgot." She was mortified by the fact that he interpreted her invitation as an appeal to resume their sexual relationship. She said, "No, I didn't forget." He said, "You know how I feel about you, Katie. Why, I could take up right where we left off." "No, Dad. I know you're having a bad time now, being alone and all, and you know your ma is never enough for me. I'd like to take care of you again, Katie." "No thanks, Dad. I want to tell you, as an adult, that there will never be anything sexual between us again." This was the last thing he wanted to hear, and she could tell from his sulking expression that he was crestfallen. She continued, "As far as I'm concerned, what we did was wrong, and I wanted to talk to you so I could tell you that." "Aw, Katie, I never meant. Also, I want to make sure that you don't try anything with my little girls." He was taken aback. He said, "How could you even think such a thing? I love those two as if they were my own. I'd never do anything to hurt them." "I was your own, and you hurt me. Why wouldn't you do it again?" "It was different with you and me. Special. We were real close. You know how I feel about you." "Well, I feel the same way about your kids. It's like you're all mine." She shouted now to get this through his thick skull. "That's what worries me. They aren't yours, and neither am I. I'm an adult with my own life, and the kids belong to me and Roger." "I know that. I don't want them ever to experience what I went through with you, and if you ever lay a hand on them, I'll prosecute." He suddenly became indignant. "Oh, you think you're so smart, kicking your husband out so you can do as you please. Well, I'm on to you. I know what you're up to." "The same goes for you. I want you to know I'm watching you with my kids, and as far as what I do with my personal life, it's none of your damn business. Guess whatever you like. I don't care. You don't fool me now, and you never did. You always were a little tease, and you always will be. How do you think we ended up together in bed in the first place?" He was using guilt trips as a weapon now, always the manipulator. The conversation had now reached the limits of its utility. Kathleen said, "Let's not talk about it anymore, Dad." "Okay, Katie, I have things to do. Okay? I'm out the door, but you let me know if you change your mind. I'll be around, and I'll be ready. You just let me know." In the aftermath of the demise of her marriage and the line she drew in the sand with her father, Kathleen embarked on the enterprise of buttressing her self-esteem. She became passionate about feminism, even opening a feminist bookstore in her hometown. She explored lesbianism, having an affair with a feminist speaker she met at a conference named Polly. Polly would be the first person to whom Kathleen divulged her history with incest. Eventually, their affair became a long-term committed relationship. Kathleen, Polly, and Kathleen's daughters even changed to dress, moving across the country. Kathleen enjoyed more happiness and fulfillment with Polly than with her boyfriends and Roger. Kathleen's relationship with Polly failed in a similar fashion as her marriage to Roger. Polly was too self-centered and insensitive for someone with Kathleen's history. Kathleen wanted her to be a leader, but Polly only resented her for placing unwanted obligations at her feet. After Kathleen and Polly separated, Kathleen paid a visit to her parents' house. She had written a manuscript of her memoir concerning the experience of being raped by her father. Andy read it and wanted to aggress against Tom, though he ultimately thought better of it. During her visit with her parents, Kathleen went on a walk with Tom. She decided to confront him about how the incest impacted her over the years. She opened with, "Let's talk about us, Dad. It's important for me to tell you how I feel and what it's done to me. I've tried before, but I don't think you understood me." He said, "You know, I always loved you and never took advantage of you." "But that's just it, Dad. You did take advantage of me. I was a child, but I never forced you." "You did, Dad, not with violence, but in subtle, manipulative ways." He said, "And there were plenty of times I could have. Do you remember the time you and your ma got so drunk and I had to take you both home and undress you and put you to bed? That was the night we celebrated my engagement to Roger. Well, you really got me excited that night. I put Ma to bed first, and then I came into your room and undressed you. My God, you had a gorgeous figure, and I got a bad hard-on. It wasn't easy for me not to crawl into bed with you. Your Ma was out cold. She would never have known. But, Dad, I wouldn't have let you get into bed with me that night. Don't you remember that I said no to you? I still could have forced you, and I didn't. She couldn't have surgically implanted common sense into this man's head. Kathleen said, I brought along an article that I want you to read. It's written by the director of a child sexual abuse center in California, where they deal with incest like ours. There was also a 3-hour television special about the center recently. I wish you could have seen it. I think your ma saw part of it. Kathleen said, the fathers took full responsibility for what happened between them and their daughters. He actually said, I still think you were responsible too. She said, I know you do, and it's true that I acquired some sexual skills through you, and that I also came to manipulate and use you. But I wasn't responsible for the beginning. I was only a child. He digested this intel for a moment. Kathleen filled the gap of silence with, sometimes I'd like to go to the center and receive counseling. Would you mind if I did? He said, I never knew you thought you needed help with that. Kathleen said, I know you didn't. I could never make you understand how I felt, and I could never tell anyone else. But I realize now that it disturbs me terribly, and I have to find some way to get over it. Have you ever talked to anyone about it? No, but you know I had to take 12 hours of psychology courses for my job. Would you talk to anyone about it now? Would you go with me to talk to someone? I don't think so. I just don't feel a need to. I think if two people are attracted to each other, it's okay for them to have sex. The sexual revolution has done that for us. Even when it's your own daughter? Sure, why not? It seems natural. You must have been going through a real bad time in your life when we began, weren't you, Dad? Well, sure. You know how your ma is about sex. I just wasn't getting what I needed. Some people just need more sex than others. I've told you that before. I don't care what you needed, Dad. It wasn't right for you to use me. I can't have sex unless it's someone I'm really attracted to, like you. I couldn't use a prostitute because of my job. I told you that before. Some call it chemistry. I don't know. I just know I had that feeling for you. I still do. I could still go to bed with you and feel good about it. Of course, you don't want to, do you? That's right, Dad. I don't want to. You're my father, and I care about you as a daughter. It's concern I feel, not sexual desire. He took a stand. Well, I just did what I thought was right. As far as I'm concerned, I taught you everything you needed to know. Would you mind if I talked to the man in California? No, I guess not. But I just hope you won't use it against me. I'd do anything for you, Kathy. You know that, don't you? I don't know. I only know that back then I started to get into real trouble in my head. I felt guilty, ashamed. I couldn't confide to anyone. Do you have any idea how depressed it made me? Sure, I knew you felt bad, but I thought it was because you weren't getting enough sex. No, Dad. I was depressed because I didn't know what to do about it. Do you think Mother knew what was going on? No, never. She's naive. She believes in people. She doesn't like to think about the bad things that could happen between them. Do you know the only way I could figure out to help myself? What? Marrying Roger. I knew I had to get away from you, but I wasn't strong enough to do it alone. I thought he'd protect me and take care of me, so I married him. I thought that was a mistake, you know. I really wanted to see you out in the world. You belong out there. Remember, I told you I'd send you to college. I didn't want to be obligated to you financially. If I were, I thought, I'd have to take care of you sexually again, and I couldn't face that. Anyway, I was afraid to go out into the world. I was afraid to grow up. It did seem strange, a good-looking girl like you still living at home at 21. Of course it did. I was all messed up, and I still am. What do you mean? You seem okay to me. Dad, I can't get along with other people. I don't trust anyone. Or I trust them too much. I have a regular pattern of destroying relationships. I'm hopelessly dependent. You're just having trouble because of this divorce thing you're going through. That's part of it, but so is the incest. I can't straighten out anything until I take care of that. I have 2 children to raise, and at the moment I'm in no shape to do it. I need to get help. Do whatever you think you have to do. This, as his attempt at moral support, was beyond inadequate. The next day, Kathleen talked to her mother about her history of being sexually abused by her father. Her mother said, "Your father's awful antsy. What's wrong with him?" "How's he treating you?" "He's not good. Moody, pouting, same old thing. His nose is out of joint because Grandma's here. Same old story. He never could stand her to visit. He told me last night he hates to see you dote on her. She's 84 years old, and she's been very sick. You don't have to justify it to me. I think you should take care of her. Part of the problem is that he hasn't got enough to do. He gardens a little, gabs with the fellows he runs into at the supermarket, but not much else. He won't go out and take a course at the college for next to nothing. He refuses to do volunteer work. He doesn't need a job because of his pension. What about you? What do you do?" "I keep busy, go about my business, do whatever I like, and that's okay with him. Mother, he's got a life of his own too, you know." "What do you mean?" "I want to tell you something about Dad and me, for my sake and for both of yours as well. I hope you're strong enough to hear what I have to say. Dad and I had an incestuous relationship." "Oh no, honey. Well, I wondered." Kathleen felt anger rising up inside of her at this revelation. She went into the sordid details. "It started when I was 8 in Heartland, and I'd crawl into bed with him. At first, he just fondled me, but eventually he did other things. And to this day, he thinks what he did was right. He thinks because he loved me, he had a right to me sexually." "Oh God, Kathy, how awful for you." "For years I couldn't tell anyone about it. I wanted to tell you, but I was sure you'd think it was my fault. I thought you wouldn't love me anymore, and I couldn't risk that. I needed your love, and I needed his. God knows I wouldn't have been in the situation in the first place if I hadn't been so desperate for his love." "Oh, I'm so sorry, honey. I'm so sorry you had to endure all that." "Mother, did you ever know about it?" "No, never." "Well, it may have flashed through my mind a couple of times, but nobody talked about incest back then. Kathy, you should have told me." Kathleen was thinking, "Mother, you should have asked." Instead, she asked her what she would have done if she had disclosed it to her. Her mother said, "I'd have divorced him. I almost did anyway. He was impossible to live with sometimes. I guess unconsciously I felt you wouldn't do anything about it. I felt you'd take his side. I would have divorced him." "Oh, honey," Kathleen said. "Were you jealous of me?" "No, not jealous. I used to wonder, though, why he always insisted you come out to dinner with us. It didn't make sense to me. But no, I wasn't jealous. I was hurt that he made your life so miserable, setting down such tight restrictions, calling the police, watching every move you made. He told me you never gave him enough sex. He said that's why he had to turn to me." Her mother was outraged. She said, That is a lie. I never said no to him, even when my back was so bad and I was in pain. Never. Kathleen said, "Lying bastard. What a double standard he lives by." And the governor gave him an award for 30 years of enforcing the law. "Have you told your brother?" "Yes, he's very angry with Dad and very concerned about you." "Ellen, have you told her?" "I've hinted at it." "Don't tell her, Kathy. I don't think she could handle it." "I think she can, Mother, and now's a good time while she's seeing a psychiatrist." "I didn't know that. She should have told me." "Mother, try to face it. This is a family of secrets. We don't even really know each other because none of us can be honest about what we feel. We don't even really know each other because none of us can be honest about what we feel. We go along propped up by our happy family facade, but none of the real problems get solved. Ellen should have seen a doctor years ago when her school counselor advised it. Andy's 29, and he hasn't the slightest notion of what to do with his life. It's clear the kind of shape I'm in due to prolonged avoidance of reality, and now you're stuck to dealing with a problem that's more than 20 years old. We're a mess, Mother. I'd say the facade is wearing pretty thin." Kathleen told Ellen over lunch about what her father had done to her. Ellen encouraged Kathleen to forget about it. Ask any victim and they will tell you, A, that is a facile response, and B, it is easier said than done. It was a tone-deaf response and beyond unhelpful. Kathleen approached her mother again to ask her what she was going to do now that she found out that her husband raped her daughter for years. Kathleen said, "You have some choices. You can ask him to leave. You can say you've had enough of his terrible behavior and demand that he get some help, offering to go with him if he likes. You can tell him I've told you about the incest and offer to discuss it with him. Or I can sit down with the two of you and tell you how I feel and ask you both to come to California with me." "Oh, I couldn't go, Kathy. I don't know what to do about your father. I'm afraid of what he might do. What if he tries to kill himself? Or one of us?" It became clear to Kathleen that her mother considered this issue to be Kathleen's problem and hers to solve on her own. Her mother went on, "He has a gun, you know. If you'll sleep better, we can hide it, and if you like, I'll ask him to go to California with me. He said he'd do anything for me. Let's see if he means it." "Oh yes, why don't you do that? Then maybe he and I can talk about it when he gets back." Kathleen proposed to her father the idea of going to the counseling center in California. He said, "Oh, I couldn't do that. No, that would be too hard for me." "You said you'd do anything for me. Will you do this?" He always had a guilt trip in his quiver. "And what if I'm the monster you say I am? What will happen to me?" "You'll understand yourself better. That's all that will happen. Besides, you'll be helping me." "What will Mother and Grandma think?" "They'll think you're on a business trip with me." "You mean we should lie to them?" "They don't have to know everything. When you get back, you can tell Mother whatever you like. I think she knows something's up anyway. I think she's always known." "I'll have to think about it." Just then, Kathleen's mother and grandmother walked into the room. Kathleen proclaimed to them, "I'm going to California on a business trip, and I want Dad to go with me, but he doesn't want to." "Why not?" Tom said, "We can't afford it." Kathleen's mother said, "Sure we can, Tom. We've got enough money. Go along with her." "I don't know. I'll have to think about it." The day of their departure, Tom was still non-committal about the trip. Her mother said to Kathleen, "Your father's gone walking. Do you think I should make a reservation for him?" "Yes, go ahead. I think he'll go." Tom returned from his walk to find his suitcase packed. He played dumb, saying, "What's the idea?" Her mother said, "You are going, aren't you?" He said, "Do you think I should?" "Yes, I do. I think it'll do you good." During their first session with the therapist, whose name was Doug, her father was just as mired in denial as ever. He said, "As far as this thing goes, I don't feel I did anything wrong. I just figured I was helping her, showing her what she needed to know so she wouldn't get in trouble like her sister did." "Tell me about your past, Thomas. What plans did you have for your life?" "During the war, I left a good job in Chicago to join the Marines. I felt it was my duty to serve my country. My family's aggressive, and they believe in fighting. My wife's family doesn't, so they condemned me, and she never forgave me for joining up and leaving her when she was pregnant with Kathy. I didn't see Kathy until she was 2 years old. I was taught discipline in the Marines, and my job when I came back home was as a disciplinarian, a prison guard. But I guess I went too far with that. Kathleen tells me I was too strict at home." "What were your goals then, Thomas, when the war was over?" "I wanted security, solid benefits, a good pension when I retired, so I took a job with the state." "Do you feel you set high goals for yourself?" "Yes, sir." "Did you also set high moral standards?" "That's right." Often when we do that, Thomas, when we're so strict with ourselves, something gives. Something gave with you. Do you know what it was?" "No, not really." "I don't really. I guess I turned into a monster." "You're not a monster. You're a human being. You've only been human." Doug turned to Kathleen and asked her about how she felt about going to see him. She said, "Good and necessary. I know it will help me, and I hope it helps my parents. They've been married almost 40 years, and they're just not getting along. They're at each other's throats all the time. I think if we deal with the incest, it might clear the air for all of us." Doug said, "I agree. Tell me what positive things you see in your parents' marriage." "I think they really love each other. I think, even in spite of the incest, they want to stay together. It sounds like a strong marriage, and that's a rare thing, very positive. What about you? How can all this be positive for you?" "I'm not sure. I don't know." "I do. You're sensitive, compassionate, intuitive, and the incest has made you strong. You've had to be strong to survive. Let's go back to when it started. What do you remember, Kathy?" "I was about 8. Mother was away at night, working. The wind used to blow through the old boards of our house and make scary sounds, bang the shutters, whistle around the corners. And one night there was a storm, and I became frightened and went downstairs and crawled into bed with Dad. He began fondling me, and I didn't know what to do." Kathleen began to cry. "I didn't know what to do." "How did you feel?" "I felt comforted, secure, safe, but I didn't like his voice. It was strange, creepy, and I didn't like it when he began comparing me to Mother." "What do you remember about the beginning, Thomas?" "We were always real affectionate with our kids. We'd hold them a lot. I'd sit in a chair and rock Andrew, Kathy's brother, and she'd always be right there wanting me to rock her too. So I'd put them both on my lap." "What happened when you rocked Kathy?" "I'd get excited." "Do you mean you'd become aroused? Get an erection?" "Yes." "What did you think about that? That it was bad or that it felt good?" "That it felt good." "Kathy, do you remember your father getting an erection?" Kathleen nodded. "What did you think about it?" "I was curious, and it interested me. Then Mother took me aside and told me not to sit on his lap anymore." Tom said, "I never knew about that." Kathleen said. In fact, she told me not to sit on any man's lap. Did your mother tell you about sex? Only in a very sketchy way. Nobody talked much about sex in those days. And the fact that she was a German Methodist didn't help. Sometimes religions give us the idea that sex is bad. And it's not, of course. It's not bad to have sexual feelings. It's natural. I don't think our Creator would have given us a sexual apparatus and function and then made the use of them bad. Thomas, what would you have thought if Kathy had sat on your brother's lap and your brother had had an erection and fondled her? I would have hated it. I'd have killed him. Do you remember fondling Kathy? Yes. But that's all I did when she crawled into bed with me. I only fondled her. I thought it was good for her, but I guess I was wrong. I shouldn't have done it. What did you say? I was wrong. I shouldn't have done it. What was going on with you at that time, Thomas? With your job, with your wife? My wife and I both worked because we needed the money. We didn't believe in babysitters. We thought a parent should be with the kids, so we arranged to work different hours. When I came home, she'd leave for work. So you didn't spend much time together? That's right. My wife worked hard. Even when she was home, she was usually tired. Did you feel you had enough sex with her? I guess not. As I say, she was often tired. Could you talk to your wife about what you needed? Not really. Could you talk to her if you had a problem at work? No, I guess not. If I did that, I'd feel sort of weak, you know? I tried not to bring my problems home. I tried to leave them at work. Could you cry in front of your wife? No. How did Kathy help you? She was always right there. She was my favorite child. Still is. And we were real close. We did everything together. Hunting, fishing, camping. You should have seen how she could pitch a tent. I was so proud of her. She brought you pleasure, didn't she? She brought you joy. And how was she different from your wife? Well, in every way. She had, what is it they say? All the accessories. You mean she developed early? Yes. And how was that different from your wife? Well, she was flat-chested, and Kathy was extremely the opposite. Kathleen interjected. I know that really attracted him. When he fondled me, he often talked about my breasts and how they were so much bigger than mother's. And she smelled good, didn't she, Thomas? Oh, she was soft and affectionate and sweet, and her personality. It was just great. And she smelled good, right? Yes, she smelled good too. Let me tell you about tenderness. When Kathy sat on your lap, when she crawled into bed with you, she was seeking tenderness, which you needed at that time also, but couldn't ask for from your wife. Your daughter gave you tenderness willingly, with love and trust, and when she did, you became aroused. This isn't unusual. It happens a lot. Mothers become aroused nursing their babies. A man came to me recently who had an erection while hugging his little boy, and he was appalled. He asked what was happening, what kind of person he was turning into. I told him what I'm telling you. It's natural and good. What is not natural and good is what people do after they become aroused. What you did with Kathy was not natural and good. You owe your daughter an apology, Thomas. Yes, sir, I know that now. You see, you were the parent. She was the child. You were in control. Thomas nodded. How do you feel about each other now? Thomas, look at your daughter and tell her. I love you just as much as I always have. I'm sorry I got you into this mess. Kathy, how do you feel? Numb and relieved. And I'm not angry anymore. I love my parents, and I know they care for me. For years, in one way or another, I thought, this can't be happening to me. I'm glad I've finally faced the fact that it did. I also want to talk to my wife about all of this and to my 2 other children. A few hours later, Kathleen and Tom discussed the meeting with Doug. Her father apologized to her again, but then he fingered the wound all over again when he said, I'm not sure about his slant on this thing. I never thought we were hurting anyone. I thought it would be good for you. He left for home early. As he departed for his plane, he left her with, I'm sorry I got you into this. I hope you can get out of it. As usual, she was left to deal with it alone. Kathleen underwent a lengthy legal battle to regain custody of her kids after she relinquished parental rights to Roger during a time when she was dealing with the fallout of a breakdown. She had been dealing with the symptoms of PTSD because of the incest and the difficulties presented by failed relationships. Her parents supported her during this trial. Being an incest victim, Kathleen was considered damaged goods by Roger's attorney. Tom took the stand and declared that not only had the incest occurred, but that he was entirely to blame. It was what Kathleen had waited so long to hear. Kathleen's suitability as a parent was also called into question because she was a lesbian. The judge ruled that her history as an incest victim and status as a lesbian were not relevant to the case, since a woman can be a good parent regardless. Kathleen was granted full-time custody of her children. They had been unhappy in Roger's home, and even he admitted that Kathleen provided a more supportive and loving environment. Kathleen concluded this story with her plans on how to embark on the rest of her journey. Now I'm beginning again, this time as an adult with 2 children of my own. Always before I have been the child, insisting on absolutes, demanding reparations. Well, no more. That luxury and torment is over. I know too much. Black and white are seldom the colors in this grown-up universe. My father is neither the splendid golden-haired Marine with rosy cheeks and a shy sweetness in his smile whom I worshipped, nor the brutish, despotic monster whom I despised. He is a flawed and unhappy man of many confusions and some strengths. He tyrannized me for 10 years, holding fiercely to his narrow rationalizations, adamantly refusing to see the damage he was doing me. It took moral weakness of an extreme sort for him to exercise his destructive will so consistently for so long, but recently and in public, he took responsibility for his violation of me, and that took extraordinary courage. I still tend to see him at one or the other of these extremes, but I'm discovering that many parts of him exist in the gray area in between. We talk now. Sometimes my anger flares again. His wariness returns. We don't trust each other altogether, but we do talk. I've learned a great deal by telling my story. I hope other incest victims may experience a similar journey of discovery by reading it. If nothing else, I would wish them to hear in this tale the 2 things I needed most, but had to wait years to hear. You are not alone, and you are not to blame. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.